This is Molly Hemingway of The Federalist, inviting you to join me for the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case Conference, Friday, June 12th and Saturday, June 13th at Concordia University, Chicago. I'll be speaking and signing copies of my new book, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the U.S. Constitution. Learn more at issuesetc.org. issuesetc.org.
The emperor has no clothes on. He's buck naked. That child had to speak the truth no matter how it would make the king feel. And we have to do that today. We have to be very conscientious objectors to the madness that is gender ideology.
And most people default into this idea of feminism is this idea that men are contemptible, which is, of course, the idea behind smashing the patriarchy, and women need to be just like them and have the same equality.
The Crusades were a very belated response to many centuries of Muslim conquests, in which 2/3 of the old Christian world had already fallen to Muslim conquest.
And our faith is strong, not because of the fervor of its affection, but because of the object to which it clings, Christ. And there is no stronger faith than a really timid grasping to the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Families sailing on their family vacation on lakes in Minnesota love Issues, Etc.
We love Issues, Etc. Woo!
Well, James Talarico has been much in the news, the Democratic nominee for Senate in Texas, and now his church is also in the news. The Presbyterian Church USA, as polyamory gains visibility, monogamy faces a vote in the Presbyterian Church USA. Greetings and welcome to Issues, Etc., coming to you live on this Wednesday afternoon, June the 10th. Thanks for tuning us in. I'm Todd Wilkin. Terry Mattingly will talk about media coverage of polyamory and the U.S. Senate candidate James Talarico and his church. We'll respond to listener email and the Issues, Etc. comment line that Dr. Jordan Cooper of Just and Sinner will be alongside for a conversation on the Roman Catholic teaching of purgatory. Terry Mattingly is Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades he led the GetReligion.org website. He joins us from Ireland. Terry, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
Terry, is the fight in the Presbyterian Church USA over polyamory relevant to the Texas Senate race?
Well, let me turn that question around and ask another one that I think will lead us to what I want to say. If Ken Paxton, if the Southern Baptist Convention, whether I forget right now what kind of church he's connected with, he's an evangelical, but if the Southern Baptist Convention this week passed a resolution against same-sex marriage, called for the U.S. Supreme Court to overthrow same-sex marriage, and they said that the Supreme Court decisions on trans rights should be overturned, and they called for, because of gender binary bathrooms, etc., they called for major cuts in public schools in Texas, and or some sort of tax credit, an increased tax credit for public schools for parents who don't want to send their kids to places where there are non-binary sports teams and bathrooms. Okay, if the Southern Baptist Convention did all that, do you think reporters would ask the Republican candidate, the evangelical Ken Paxton, if he agreed with those things?
Sure.
I think anyone in their right mind knows they would ask him about that. So if you have the Presbyterian Church USA, of which this man is an on-leave seminarian, if they decide to say that monogamy is white supremacy and the expectation that only 2 people can get married, maybe 3 or more should be able to have some sort of legally binding relationship, and a powerful group in that denomination says that trans marriage and polyamory is the next human rights issue facing the nation. If they come up with some statements similar to that, or the fact that they're even debating it and arguing about it and have legislation before them that simply says monogamy is God's way or something like that. If it's relevant to ask those questions to Ken Paxton about his own private life and about the decisions of major evangelical bodies, I think journalists face the question, is it fair game to ask Talarico about his stance on some of these issues facing his own denomination in which he's preparing to be a clergy person? And I'll go even further, since this is Texas we're talking about, which Southern Baptist culture, when I was growing up in Texas, always referred to Texas as the wallet that the Southern Baptist Convention sits on, the buckle of the Bible Belt in many ways, statistically. If he's running for the Senate in Texas, I don't see how the press can't ask him questions about his religious beliefs, and especially since he's the one who has said that the story of the Annunciation with the angel delivering the news to Mary that she's going to bear the Son of God, him saying that that's one of the reasons he backs abortion rights is that that Mary was asked, which is, I'm not sure that's the proper interpretation of the scripture, but you get my point. He's already made a tremendous number of relevant questions about his own personal beliefs, which he is obviously open to saying it. He's in a seminary. He's quoting the scripture. He's interpreting the scripture from his religious point of view. I think at this point it's going to be very hard in the state of Texas not to ask him questions. And I'm going to list a number of issues that just his statements on gender, trans issues and gender, I think in a sermon 3 or 4 years ago, he said that abortion rights for trans people is one of the most important issues facing the state or something like that. I know it was abortion's rights for our trans citizens, is a crucial issue. He said enough things on the record just in his sermons. And think about that for a second. This is not political Q&As. It's his own sermons that people are going to end up talking about. I don't know how you avoid that in the state of Texas. So yes, the debates in the PCUSA, the denomination in which he is preparing for ordination, at the very least, someone has to ask him, do you think that monogamy is equal to white supremacy? And some of the other phrases that are being tossed around in that debate in his own church. So I'm going to go on the record and say that if it's okay to ask Ken Paxton about his love life, his marital history, and his own beliefs on all of these moral and social issues, it's fair game to ask Talarico about his own religious views and his own views on marriage, etc. I think it's kind of the political age we're in, and I'm already trying to picture some of the commercials that are going to get run in the state of Texas based just on what he's already said by those political action committees that rise up. And it's not like Texas has ever been known for some brass knuckles politics. So there's my answer. Yes, it's okay to ask these men questions about things they have already stated on the record of their own free will in public.
You say that the New York Times treatment of this whole issue is among the best you've ever read. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that? Simply stated, this is what happens when you assign a veteran religion writer. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with this writer's work on everything, but this is a trained, experienced religion writer. You assign her to write the story with the help of a New York Times reporter who has been based in Texas. for quite some time. So someone who knows Texas is combined with someone who has studied evangelicalism and a lot of other American movements. You end up getting a literate piece of writing about religious questions. In this case, focusing on the pastor of Talarico's church and what that pastor has said in the past. Now, we can ask whether that's relevant, but you better believe Talarico is going to be asked, do you agree with your pastor when he says that, well, don't worry about the Annunciation, that's all a myth anyway. It's just an allegory. What do you think of that? So the passage that jumped out at me in this, there's several, in this piece in the New York Times, it talked about the fact that his pastor refuses to use binary language for God, and Talarico has preached a sermon on why he doesn't believe that God can be discussed in binary terms. That's a potent theological issue. But so you end up with the following. Mr. Talarico uses the terms Lord and God, and he said has no issue with using male pronouns to refer to God. He sees the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event, he said. Now we'll come back to that. I don't believe in a progressive or conservative Christianity. I believe in a biblical Christianity, Mr. Talarico said. My faith is rooted in Scripture and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Jumping down, his campaign slogan, "It's time to start flipping tables," unquote, is a reference to a passage in the Bible when Jesus displays righteous anger over corruption in religious circles. I added that last phrase. So that's an incredibly important and literate, from a religious perspective, couple of paragraphs right there. And I want longtime listeners here to remember something that you and I have been talking about for way over a decade. Long ago, I came up with a set of 3 questions that I have always used to probe the fault lines in debates among Christians. For example, right now, the PCUSA. These would be a great 3 questions to ask in a press conference about the controversy in Talarico's own denomination. And the TMAT trio, as they became known, was later briefly adopted and kind of paraphrased into a poll by George Gallup Jr. And also Lifeway or Barna, I think it was, actually asked the TMAT trio in a poll. So here's the 3 questions. Now, that first one will sound familiar. Are biblical accounts of the resurrection of Jesus accurate? Did this event happen? That's number 1 in the TMAT trio. Number 2 is salvation found through Jesus alone? Was Jesus being literal when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life? No one comes to the Father except through me. That's question number 2. And question number 3, which George Gallup liked because it didn't state this in the context of homosexuality. It just asked the question bluntly, is sex outside of marriage a sin? Now, that one's going to be relevant to a discussion of monogamy and polyamory, or you're redefining marriage and the nature of relationships. I'll tell you, Todd, I never thought I would see one of the 3 TMAT questions asked, if not asked, answered voluntarily in a New York Times story about politics. Let me state this as clear as I can. We have a lot of trouble trying to get religion writers to ask bishops doctrinal questions to get clear answers. Trying to ask clear doctrinal questions to political candidates is a whole other level of inquiry. But like I said, in the state of Texas, I don't think Talarico can make some of the statements he's made and not have reporters ask him for clarification about that. And I think if there's a debate, which I assume there will be, they certainly will be pushed by the other candidate. And at the same time, yes, I think it's fair game to ask Ken Paxton questions about some of his religious statements and his own actions in his life. So I think in the buckle of the Bible Belt, the New York Times needs to keep this team together covering this Senate race. You're not going to be able to cover the race for the U.S. Senate in the state of Texas without some theological study. You're covering an outspoken evangelical of a very interesting, complex, and I would say, my own personal opinion, flawed nature. And you literally have a seminarian from one of the two fastest shrinking denominations in American life, in the liberal mainline Protestant world. So let me give you another interesting one that jumped out at me, talking about the church that Talarico goes to and his pastor. Among the congregation, about 240 people that Sunday, are multiple people who have been drawn to the church by hearing about it from Mr. Talarico's public appearances. The church's in-person attendance has risen by about 50 people on an average Sunday over the last year. Well, that means Talarico was attending a church before that averaged about 180 to 190 people, which for a mainline Protestant church is not bad at all. But in comparison to other churches, even in Austin, Texas, in many different traditions, let alone Houston and Dallas, that's a tiny congregation. And we can ask, is it in his interest, Talarico's interest, to be talking so much about his own religious perspective? Let's get that enunciation thing cleared up. Here's another very fine set of paragraphs in this story. He was on Joe Rogan, I think it's Joe Rogan last year. Mr. Talarico framed the New Testament account of an angel visiting Jesus' mother before her pregnancy as a story that pointed to a biblical basis for abortion rights. Quote, "The angel comes down and asks Mary if this is something she wants to do, and she says, 'If it is God's will, let it be done,'" Mr. Talarico said. "To me, that is an affirmation in one of our most central stories that creation has to be done with consent. You cannot force someone to create," unquote. Mr. Rigby, who is Talarico's extremely liberal pastor and very openly so, the guy with a non-binary God. Mr. Rigby recalled preaching on the passage in the past. He wasn't bothered by the fact that in the text, the angel does not, in fact, ask Mary if she accepts the pregnancy, as Mr. Talarico framed it, but rather tells her it will happen. The pastor then responds, "It's mythological, not historical." Okay, that's very well and directly worded based on actual sermon material from Talarico. So that's the kind of the level of discourse we've got in this New York Times story. Now, sure, there are things I'd like to ask about that were not included, but it's a long story. And as you said, I'm convinced this is an extremely well done story. And the fact that the New York Times published it really opens up a lot of these topics for discussion by other periodicals and not just conservative ones.
Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of polyamory, U.S. Senate candidate James Talarico, and the Presbyterian Church USA. When we come back, does it harken back to 2008 and Barack Obama's controversy with his pastor?
Social conservatives also think that none of us can flourish simply with freedom. So one of the ways in which a social conservative will differ from a libertarian, even though both are frequently classified as being on the right or housed on the right, is the idea that none of us is born ready for the responsibilities of liberty.
Ryan Anderson of the Ethics and Public Policy Center talking about his presentation at the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case Conference.
So we need families, we need communities, we need churches and synagogues, we need schools and universities to form us. We also need law to form us. Law and culture, they both shape us, they shape our beliefs, they shape our actions. And so if we want to defend freedom, we also need to defend formation. And that means the ability to draw a distinction between liberty and license.
You can hear Ryan Anderson making the case for social conservatism at the Making the Case Conference, June 12th and 13th at Concordia University, Chicago. Register online at issuesetc.org.
Essential exercise for the Christian mind. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Learning Latin can help your student think more clearly, understand English grammar, and prepare to study science and theology. And teaching Latin doesn't have to be intimidating. Memoria Press publishes a Latin curriculum that is easy to use, even if you don't know Latin yourself. Learn more at memoriapress.com. Save $5 when you enter the coupon code LPR26MP. Memoria Press, saving Western civilization one student at a time.
Lutherans for Life provides unique gospel-centered, life-issue-focused educational resources, audio-video training, post-abortion counseling, and more from a Lutheran perspective. Learn about LFL resources and forming a life team or life chapter or becoming a life advocate by calling 888-364-LIFE or by calling 888-364-5433 or visiting lutheransforlife.org. lutheransforlife.org.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of polyamory, U.S. Senate candidate James Talarico, and the Presbyterian Church USA. Terry, does this put you in mind at all of the 2008 Democratic presidential primaries where then Senator Barack Obama had his campaign distracted by the comments dug up by ABC News from his pastor, Jeremiah Wright, of a very controversial nature, and then the candidate was kind of noncommittal at first, and eventually his campaign had to disavow the statements entirely.
Well, and that was the idea that America has done things so bad that God should, I'm paraphrasing, God should damn America, which he shouted in slightly more colorful language. Now, I think I wrote a column at that time that basically what this minister was preaching was like a liberal version of what Pat Robertson was saying at the time, that God is going to damn America for America's actions on abortion and gay rights and whatever. It was a very similar theological construction. But you're right, but here's the difference. Barack Obama was running in a national election, able to draw people in LA and Hollywood and New York and whatever, was running as the first African-American candidate. That had a lot of power behind it in terms of major voting constituencies, et cetera. That's different than a race in the state of Texas. I'm not sure forget immigration for a second and the very lively issues of immigration and the issues of Muslim exclusive communities being built in the state of Texas, something I expect to come up in the election as well for debate. Forget all of that for a second. I think it's going to be interesting to see how Protestant, charismatic, and conservative Catholic Latinos respond to some of these issues in language when these polls get going. Frankly speaking, if the Republicans, Donald Trump, of course, had run a conventional candidate for the Senate, I don't think anybody would be thinking this race had any question to it at all. I mean, try to picture if Talarico was running against a morally conservative, bilingual Latino man or woman in the state. If they had picked a different candidate for the next generation of Senate life in Texas. So I think religion will be a part of this, and I agree with you that the Obama image from the past is certainly relevant, but this is Texas. I grew up in Texas, and at one point, there's a great phrase in the piece where they're talking with one of the critics of all of this, of Talarico and Rigby, of their views. He finally says, the man's name is Wilder, Jamie Wilder. Wilder, who has written critically, Mr. Talarico, said the attraction may fade, talking about voters considering voting for Talarico. When they hear Mr. Talarico's past aggressive comments, it's that direct quote, Our trans community needs abortion care too, unquote, as he did in the 2022 sermon at St. Andrew's Church. This other man just said, that dog is not going to hunt in Texas, which is a very Texas way of stating it. That doesn't preach in Texas would be another way Texans would put it. And I'll make one other point. Don't forget that Talarico grew up Baptist in Texas, and his background was a moderate Baptist world, when that was exactly my background growing up in Texas. But his moderates were way to the left of the moderates I grew up with. And I'll just say that in the state of Texas, someone being an ex-Baptist, that has power in Texas too. Because basically, and I know this from firsthand experience, when you tell people, well, I was Texas and I converted to this, a lot of Texans are just going to interpret that as the saying, this man is too big for his britches. He thinks he's too smart. He thinks he's smarter than me. And a lot of Texans aren't going to like that. And that's going to that's going to make some powerful ads.
On the subject of the Presbyterian Church USA, they have permitted same-sex clergy in same-sex unions since 2011, before Obergefell.
Oh, of course.
Why are
way early?
Should someone be asking why they're kind of just now getting around to saying, oh yeah, and by the way, you don't have to be monogamous either?
Well, but they tried to say that, well, there are monogamous same-sex relationships. But then I've been covering this in the Presbyterian Church since the 80s. In 1980, back in the mid to late 1980s, they seriously considered a resolution that basically said sex outside of marriage is no big deal. And I wrote a story about it, and all heck fire broke loose in the Denver area and people talking about it. And I'm not saying I did it, but as that began to get some coverage by other media, the resolution was quietly pulled off the table, if my aging brain remembers the details from the mid-1980s correctly. Is this candidate going to be asked where he stands right now on trans issues in medical care? You know, the public funding of transition care in Texas, and whether the state should speak out, try to stop it. Or how about First Amendment issues on gender, religious freedom on gender, what people can say about gender in public life? The list just goes on and on. His statements on gender, sexuality, marriage, etc. alone are going to be blockbuster stuff in a state that is as crazy about sports alone as Texas. Then you thrown in the very strong debates about public education versus private education versus tax breaks, for private education, etc. He's already staked out enough positions on gender that I think there's a laundry list of valid political questions that I can't see reporters in Texas, not voters, reporters in Texas asking questions about it of both candidates as a major part of this election. And I guarantee you the GOP candidate wants to answer questions about gender transition issues, public funding of abortion, public funding of gender transition issues. What is this? How does this affect bathrooms and showers in our schools? The Republican guy wants those questions answered, and if the press won't ask them, he'll do it himself. Talarico has put some speed bumps in his own path if he wants a calm, low-key, discreet set of discussions of these things inside the state of Texas.
Terry, you are joining us from Ireland. Is there anything that you can report to us in the aftermath of that brutal stabbing attack in Belfast and then the riots that broke out the next day?
Well, I was in a small town in Ireland, the last place where the Titanic drew landfall in Cobb. I'm a long way from Belfast and from the rest of the Irish world. So I just probably know what you know off the internet at this point. But this is, the story could not possibly have taken a worse turn than having vigilantes in response to this attempted beheading on a city street, the fact that from what I'm reading, it appears to be turning now into militia attacks on the Muslim community, with homes being burned, businesses being burned. And that's the worst possible thing that could happen in the greater UK world. I know Ireland is not a part of the UK, but in the Isles of Britain, which are all pretty tense on these issues, you couldn't have had a worse thing happen than what appears to be unfolding right now. So I would certainly urge our listeners to pay close attention and don't settle for what you're seeing in social media. A lot of this is going to be on video, and as terrible as it is to watch fires and rioting and whatever, let's see how the greatly divided press on immigration issues, let's see how this gets covered. But I'll go right on the record here myself and say I think that turning to vigilante rioting and burning of people's homes, there is no justification for that at all. So the issue now is to see how much the press will use this rioting, this terrible rioting and stuff, as a way to stop discussing some of the violence that has made these people that angry on the non-immigration side of the story. I can't tell you much more about it than that. I can tell our listeners to start paying attention to it now. And they might want to read some of the gripping material that's been written in the last year or two on the issue of whether Great Britain is drawing close to some sort of rural versus urban civil war. That's inflammatory language, I know, but I think our listeners will want to dig into that.
Terry Mattingly is Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McNeil Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website. He joined us from Ireland. Terry, thanks.
Glad to be here.
We will respond to your email and the Issues Etc. comment line next.
The church's music from the 20th century. The 17th century. The 11th century. The 8th century. The 4th century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Education and edification. You're listening to Issues Etc.
What did Martin Luther mean when he wrote that Christians live in Christ through faith and in the neighbor through love? And what's the difference between self-improvement and self-transcendence? Find out in the Issues Etc. Book of the Month for June, Lift Your Eyes, How to Live Outside Yourself. Learn more and purchase Lift Your Eyes at issuesetc.org or by calling Concordia Publishing House 1-800-325-3040. Lift Your Eyes, How to Live Outside Yourself, the Issues Etc. Book of the Month for June.
Birds sing, cows moo, thunderstorms wake you from a deep sleep, but for many, they can't hear it. They're deaf, living in a world of total silence. The Epitha Lutheran Mission Society for Deaf Ministry is the only recognized service organization in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod devoted exclusively to the deaf and hard of hearing. Their mission is to bring the gospel message of Jesus' love and saving grace to those who are deaf. Learn more at elms-deaf.org.